Hello, and welcome to Strange Dominions, where we attempt to unlock the mysteries behind the unseen and unheard, unknown and unknowable. I am your host, Octavian Graves.
And I'm your co-host, Ian Burton.
Tonight, Ian and I speak with Jason Miller. Jason is an author, teacher, and magician. Jason has written 6 books, has been practicing magic for over 30 years, and has a plethora of classes.
Jason Miller is somebody that I've been following in the occult community for some time. He's an absolute wealth of wisdom and experience, and it was just an honor to have him on the show and be able to talk, one-on-one with him and pick his brain about, some of the more interesting aspects of magic that we often don't get to discuss or look into just in books. But we have here a copy of his newest book, Consorting with Spirits, which is just absolutely amazing. It's something that can be put to practical use, and it's not only for beginner or intermediate magicians, but anybody in the practice is going to get something out of this. And we're going to talk more about it in the interview.
I really enjoyed talking with him about the time he evoked the Jersey Devil and our conversation on the nature of spirits and how spirits differentiate from each other.
Same. It's often that we don't get to peek into an experienced magician's mind in terms of how their magic relates to what oftentimes people consider the paranormal. Even though as a focus of this podcast, we've done a lot of work to show our listeners that the intersection between things like folklore and what people do consider the paranormal, the Jersey Devil being one of the most popular and famous cases, the fact that Jason has a history where he was able to explore and work with that particular legend and the spirit behind it, it was just fascinating. It was like a once-in-a-lifetime peek into that crossover, which is really a focus of what we're trying to do. But just speaking of Jason it was really cool. Like he's down to earth and knowledgeable, and anybody who has the opportunity to share some words with him, you're going to pick up a lot, especially if you're practicing.
It was a really fun conversation to have, and I also really enjoyed his insight into grimoires and the application of meditation in spirit contact and all that stuff. There is a Patreon segment for this episode, so if you are not a patron, please go sign up. It is only $4 a month, and you get exclusive access to the extras of this episode and more, plus merchandise and the opportunity to be on the show. As always, if you have seen something strange or unusual, such as a cryptid, a spirit, a UFO, or anything in between, please send us an email at strangedominionspodcast@gmail.com. We are also looking for Bigfoot witnesses to come on and tell their stories, so if you have seen Sasquatch, Bigfoot, or anything like that, please send us an email and we'll get you on the show. Without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, this is our interview with Jason Miller. All right, tonight we are speaking with Jason Miller, who has written 6 books, been doing magic for over 30 years, and has a multitude of classes. How are you doing tonight?
I'm doing all right. I'm sitting here counting books in my head. Has it really been 6? It really has.
Yeah, absolutely. I was just looking it up before the show, too.
Yeah. Oh, I'm getting old.
Now, the listeners on the podcast won't be able to see this, but is that because we have you on video here? Is that your real library behind you, or is that just the background?
No, this is real, 100%. I don't do fake backgrounds.
It's very impressive.
Yeah, absolutely.
Real library, real office.
We judge the caliber of our magician guests based on the size of their library. No, really, that's a good one.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's not the size that counts.
Right. Yeah.
It's how you flip the page, really.
Exactly. So you've been doing magic for a long time, and a lot of your books are on very specific aspects of magic. And so the first question I have for you is, what was the impetus for this book and the specific subjects that you have in it?
Students, really. So, I make my living teaching courses on magic, and some of those courses have a Q&A section where a couple times a week, I'm sitting down, looking at a list of questions, answering them all. And the way people think about spirits and the way people deal with spirits, it's something that I always keep coming back to. Like, let's take this down to brass tacks. What would this look like if it was a person we were talking about rather than a spirit? And so many things suddenly become clear. So many ideas suddenly go away. Like the idea that you can generalize that spirits are good, spirits are bad, spirits are this. Like, if you start saying, well, people, especially like, certain types, like, oh my God, right? Like, you can't, well, people from Oregon are bad. They're not. Like, clearly, there are some, just as many crappy people as everywhere else and just as many good ones. So it came out of answering questions, of seeing students in their successes with spirits and their trials with spirits. And so it was sort of like my way of saying, like, all right, this is some common sense wisdom that I keep preaching to students. Let me put some of it in a book and make it useful to a wider audience.
And it really is so comprehensive. You cover so many different subjects, and you make it very easy to understand. And the title of the book is really cool, and it was a charge that you could be, charged with back in the Middle Ages and Renaissance times. Could you go into that a little bit?
Yeah, so this is actually the first book, and probably the only book, that I chose the title ahead of writing the book and told the publisher, this has to be the title. We can figure out, the subtitle or whatever, but like, this has to be the title. The other books, I've been more concerned with like the book itself, and like, hey, your marketing department comes up with a great title. Great. I mean, The Sorcerer's Secrets just sounds like a marketing department was like, hey, but it was fine. But consorting with spirits it kind of gets to the other part of why I wanted to write the book. Because in practice, if you are a regular practitioner, you're not doing this as a one-off or it becomes a real relationship. It becomes consorting, not just conjuring. This spirit is now in your life, right? Just like a person. And so apart from the charge, and of course it's amazing to me that people, so many people were charged that weren't doing anything, but we know that there were people conjuring spirits when they could be killed for it, Yeah. It's remarkable. And the other meaning of consorting is to have this consistent relationship, usually with an illicit person, right? Like if so-and-so is consorting with known mobsters, they didn't just meet once. They're hanging out at the Italian deli with Tony Soprano and the guys. So a magician,
it's like a nod in the street kind of thing. Like, I'll see you later.
A magician consorts with spirits. A witch consorts with spirits. And so what does this look like in a relationship? Which is why I wanted to take... There's so many ways that people interact with spirits, and they get treated as separate things, right? You read a book on evocation, but then you read another book on seances and another book on making offerings to local spirits. And it's almost like these are treated like there's no overlap, when there's an enormous amount of overlap, right? The evocation and the exorcism are very similar. They're practically the same formula. Many evocations are based on exorcisms. The only difference is you are conjuring a spirit from wherever it happens to be to appear in front of you at the edge of the circle, versus the spirit is in that guy and you're trying to get it out, but you're still conjuring by oath. You're still adjuring by oath, which is what horquizo means, and where we get the word exorcism from. So the idea of, let's start with wandering around sacred spaces near you. Let's start with what happens in the graveyard. Let's start with what happens in places where fairies dwell and relate that over to the books with all the named spirits and so on and so forth. So I kind of wanted to draw some connections that I felt hadn't been made clear, at least not in books. So
absolutely, and you did a really good job of it. And whenever I talk to people about grimoires or that kind of magic, and they start saying like, "Well, how do you know these magicians just weren't making stuff up?" And I have to tell them like, go and look at what the penalty was for being in the same room as one of these books, and you tell me if they were going to risk all that for making stuff up. And so you really have to put it in context about what was at stake with this kind of practice back then.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I'm glad you brought up the, going to sacred places and going to these kind of liminal zones, because as I said before we started, there was this kind of synchronicity between when this book came out and when I started the show. And I've been into the study of magic for a very, very long time, but I didn't actually consider the practice of it until middle of 2021 when I had a crazy mushroom trip, and it made me realize how much of more reality that there is that we can't see. And I had been into the paranormal for a very, very long time. And as I started getting into magic, the way that I could relate to it was like, there's a lot of these cryptids and things like that, and they're starting to line up with how spirits appear and how they act. Why is no one trying to use magic to contact these things? And then I read this book, and you're talking about evoking the Jersey Devil. So can you go into that a little bit about that experience and how that all happened for you?
Yeah, well, I think very much along the same lines as you when it comes to the cryptids versus the spirits. I tend to think that I always hold the idea in my head that not only is there more than we know, but more than we can know. So I'm one of those people that it's like I am very comfortable with uncertainty and the fact that even a being that I can know and sense, there's facets of it that that might always be beyond. As it should be, right? The cloud of unknowing and so on, to get medieval about it. But descriptions of cryptids often do line up with the idea of spirits. And in the Pine Barrens of New Jersey, I forget the word in the Lenape language, but it literally means the place of the dragon. Right? So the Pine Barrens is the place of the dragon. And it's a really weird zone. So first of all, here we are in the most populous state in the nation. There's 9 million people crammed into New Jersey, almost all of them in the top half, right? So it's tight. This is some place that should be fighting for every to modernize and develop square inch. But here we are with this enormous chunk of the state as protected land. You can't do anything with it. And it's the Pine Barrens, right?
That idea is always, because I'm in Maryland, and that take has always fascinated me. That actual New Jersey is not like a Midwestern state. It's not like Oklahoma or Montana. That is one of the most packed,
right,
city-oriented people, but you have wilderness in it.
Right.
And it functions that way.
If you come up from Maryland over that ferry to Cape May, right? You go up to Lewes, Delaware, and then you shoot up to Cape May. And as soon as you're past Cape May and Wildwood, you're in the woods. You've got the beach and you've got wilderness. to the point that it's like, oh, I want to get diagonally. You can't. There's nothing. You got, So it's this very haunted land connected with the presence of a dragon. And then, of course, what do we have? We have this description of the Jersey Devil, which, it's this, it's the horse head, the bat's wings, the wild, almost kangaroo-like nature of it. It almost seems like, a bunch of different species just got together and produced something, which is actually one of the legends floating around, that all these different species came together in a blue hole, which are these mysterious holes in the Pine Barren where the water stays cold all year long, and they're blue. Almost all the water in the Pine Barrens is orange because of both iron, and I guess it's cedar. But the blue holes are blue, titanium blue. And there are all kinds of legends about the pygmy pines overlooking the blue holes. There, the Jersey Devil you will find. And so I wanted to conjure the Jersey Devil. But operations in my house, in the temple, were not producing any discernible result. At least that satisfied me. There's, when you do an operation, there's very often a result, right? Like you get something, but that doesn't mean that you're getting the thing you wanted. So I always tell people, like, during the operation, roll with it. Whatever happens, like even if you are saying to yourself, I'm just daydreaming now, or I'm fantasizing. Hey, roll with it during the operation. Then afterwards, get really critical about it. Like, is there anything here? Like, this might very well be just, mental masturbation. Like, what here is surprising? What here says this isn't for me? What here is actionable, is useful, right? So then I started taking the show on the road. I'm like, let's get out into the pines. I mean, this is where the Jersey Devil is supposed to be found, out in the pines. So I started doing some work out in the pines. And then, following up on some local legends and with the help of the spirit of a dead Pines witch, Peggy Clevenger, and using a combination of different trees and herbs that are found in the Pine Barrens, and the sand, the quartz sand, because the whole area used to be underwater, constructed a ritual. And, I believe that the spirit that people know as the Jersey Devil showed up. That said, not an extremely talkative spirit, not a spirit that is like, hey, I'm here, what do you want? And, I'm going to be so useful to you. It's more like, you've called, but I've got stuff to do. I've got a big here, or I'm a little too wild for you to relate to. So it was more like, okay, this is a guardian, for this area, and I live in this area, so add me to your list of spirits. So whenever there's difficulty or danger, I feel like if I'm in that area, that I could call upon him. And certainly when I lived in that area, I made offerings as part of I used him as called his name in part of my daily offerings. So,
now that's a good take. Now, I have a question. Now, you did call upon and make contact with this spirit, essentially the Jersey Devil. Now, in your opinion, how did that spirit feel for you? Would you consider it of a different sort than some more traditional spirits or even land spirits that you've worked with? Or would you say it was kind of in line with, like a forest spirit that you might, encounter in that situation otherwise? Or would you say it was maybe of a unique type? There was a sense of mystery about it.
I would say that there's a mystery about it. It was definitely unique. It felt like something that was both wild yet also had been glorified or deified or respected or given offerings in the past, right? So it was that kind of feeling. It wasn't the feeling that you might get of connecting with spirits that are in your local woods. And it wasn't a spirit that felt neither alien to human nor completely human. So there were human elements about it, which then speaks. I sometimes think that it's easy for us to conceptualize possible futures, right? And maybe that there are multiple futures. But it's harder for us to conceptualize multiple pasts. And so when people start getting down to wanting facts from magic, what I call head questions, right? Like, I want to nail this down. What are the facts? That's where I kind of throw my hands up and say, magic, religion, spirituality, philosophy, they suck at this. Like, I'm not.
It's a work of the heart, and that's a big thing with you is heart questions, like heart questions.
Head, heart, and hand, right?
And that would be where we would align as well. I'd always tell people that is the kind of the center of my practice as well. How you would come, you kind of have to start with your heart, and that's how you approach it. And it's always made better magic.
Yeah, well, you look for that meaning. So, but when it comes to this idea of multiple paths, that human element probably comes from the Leeds, the Leeds devil story. So the local story, if you don't go with local indigenous spirit, the story is that Mother Leeds, quote unquote, had 12 children, got pregnant again, and then the 13th child was the child of the devil. Or she said, go to the devil, and off it goes into the woods where, it haunts people and even cranberry bogs to this day. But then there was that couple-year period where it was like getting a lot of newspaper coverage. People were seeing it all over the area, and I think it was 1919 or something like that. I have a few bucks on the Jersey. Yeah, here's the domestic life of the Jersey Devil.
Oh, that's so cool. That's so cool.
Or Bebop's Miscellany. Yeah.
I'm going to have to look that up.
Yeah. So one of the things that we like to do, and we've started doing this, is whenever we have an author on who has techniques in their books, we like to test them out and see how they work for us. And when I got this book, I've always wanted to connect with spirits of the land because, as you say in the book, they're already here. I don't have to call them from the depths of hell or the heights of heaven. They're already here. So let me try and connect with them first and see what they can do for me and how we can work together to contact these other spirits and things like that. And so I've done the offering rituals that is in this book and in your the protection magic book.
Yep.
And I've gotten some interesting results. And a lot of it is the questioning, rolling it with it then and then questioning it later. And so when I've done them, I've gotten a lot of very sudden random swirls of wind, weird scents, things like that. And it's a very, very unique approach, and one that I think can be adapted to any system, any pre-existing system. And, in Maryland, our Jersey Devil is the Maryland Goat Man. And there's a whole body of lore around this. And this is actually a conversation I had with BJ. And I told him, I would really like to try and, as Jason did, evoke this Goat Man and see what it does. And he was like, I asked him, well, should I do an offering ritual or should I do the headless rite? And he's like, don't do the headless rite. That's going to piss it off. Do a couple offering rituals, and then if it doesn't respond, maybe do the headless rite. But start off with that generous act and see where it goes. And there's an area in northern Maryland that we've been to before that is known for its Bigfoot sightings, and we were there and we had some pretty interesting experiences. And my idea has always been, well, let's go do magic there, and if we get this thing to respond, then maybe it's not going to have anything that it can do for us, but it will denote its nature, and we can try and dispel this whole big monkey in the woods thing, because I don't think that there's a big monkey running around the woods. I just don't. I think that this is a spirit that takes that form for whatever reason, and we need to start looking at it from that perspective and using magic to talk to it, because that's the language it really understands. That is my true belief. And another thing from this book that and I've had such a battle with meditation, as most Westerners do. And I'm so glad I read this book, because the whole time I would do it, the way I started it was through Liber Null and his motionless exercises. And I'm doing it, I'm like, I'm doing this wrong. I can't do this. I'm doing it wrong. And I read the book, I'm like, oh, okay, so there is no wrong. And that's a really helpful insight. It really helped my practice personally.
Yeah, for as influential as Liber Null and Psychonaut and also Liber Chaos were for me in the 90s as a young man, there were certain things that it did not tackle well, that Western occultism doesn't tackle very well. And meditation is often one of them. You're reading about somebody's fantasy about what meditation is like, rather than what meditation is like for really anybody. And the thing is, you will get people that will say, oh yeah, I sat with absolutely no thoughts, right? But it's clear that they're just, maybe they've cut through the most surface layer of thoughts, so they feel a little sublime, but yeah, they're still thinking, right? And so they get to this place where they feel a little bit of clarity, and then they're sitting there and they're like, they're supposed to be focusing on the breath, and instead they're sort of like, I am so clear right now. I am just, this Buddhist stuff is easy. Like I am enlightened. When I come out of here, I'm going to tell everybody how enlightened I am. They're going to be so impressed. And it's sort of, those are thoughts.
And I'm sure, so you can all agree, there's enough folks on that level.
So no one can be bad at meditation. That's the crazy thing. Meditation can be bad for a very small segment of the population, where it will trigger anxiety, but you can't be bad at it, because if you sit down and then you get distracted and you recognize distraction and release from it and go back to the meditation, that's it. That's the show. That's what we're here to do. And sure, after that, within that, there are these spaces that open up, these moments of sublime clarity and so on. But the practice itself, that's it. Like, you're doing it. Like, so, and the benefits are huge. Like, who wouldn't want to have the ability to recognize distraction and release yourself from it? I mean, it's a huge win to be like, man, I really want some White Castle. I could eat like 30 of those guys, but that's a distraction from what I really want to do, which is, not spend the rest of the night on the toilet. So I will not do that.
And I mean, for me, meditation was difficult because I couldn't figure out how it related to magic or to spirits. And the way you put it in your book really helped me specifically as a way of using meditation to discern, like to get spirit messages or discern spirit messages and things like that. And that was very helpful for me.
Excellent.
And the the aspect that I thought was really interesting was energy work, because that was a new concept for me before I read your books and before I was really introduced to you. Like, I knew what people would talk about, but it always sounded so flimsy. You know what I mean? And so I'm curious, for the people who haven't read your book, can you go into a little bit about how meditation can be used to contact spirits or to hear spirits?
Well, when we are contacting spirits, we're bridging a gap, right? Like, we're bridging an orientation. We're oriented to the physical. We are spirits, but we're organized in physical bodies. The things that we talk about as spirits aren't organized in physical bodies. They're organized in either etheric bodies, which are pretty close to the physical. So forest spirits, the ghosts, things that you can point to in a room and say, it's over there. It's not over, it's over there. And then you can go up into the astral, symbol space, and even more subtle beings where a presence is upon you, right? Like, and then to make it take more of a shape so that it's over there at the edge of the circle or over there in the crystal is actually an effort, because that's not its natural orientation. So what we're doing in any kind of spirit contact is one or more beings are getting out of their comfort zone. And so if you are just a strict evocation, like, this is my grimoire and it says everything that I need to know, and if it's not in here, then it's crap and I don't want to know about it, right? And so then they will get on the podcast and say, like, a serious evocation can take 3 hours or more and could take 12 different, and so sometimes, and it can, they're not wrong, sometimes these evocations are being done with people and they're reading the book and they're evoking, like, come here, and then they get done after 15 minutes of chanting and evocation. They look over at the crystal, like, nope, not here yet, let's go again. It's like, dude, give it a shot, like, give it a chance, slow your mind down, slow your roll. Why don't you stretch out to it? Like, you are forcing it, like, you're like fracking reality. You're just like I'm not successful unless the walls are bleeding and my Aunt Matilda comes into the room and sees the same spirit that I do.
Absolutely. And that, there was a point in your book I wanted to bring up in relation to that, in your book, but as you said earlier, that it's the idea that spirits are individual. And you have a lot of the kind of the outspoken natures that the push in the revival these days is the focus against kind of psych models and more to the objective reality. But what I've noticed, and it's not to call anybody out, but a lot of times people who fall on that, well, spirits are, they're objective, but they still kind of go the opposite and do exactly what you said, and they try to force it into this model, which actually kind of really, when you get down to it, acts like they're not. They act like there's something, it's just about you, that you can force this cosmic presence instead of this communication, which is ironic. But in the fact that you wrote this book and the content you put in there, that gets to the nature of it, and I appreciate you saying that.
But that's where the meditation comes in. You quiet the mind, and then you can hear the things that you don't normally hear. The mind is a lot like, we can think of a lake or a body of water, right? If it's constantly agitated, if you're looking at the lake or a pond just after a storm, it's very murky. You can't see anything in it. But if you let it calm, you let it be still for a little while, what happens? The water becomes clear. Now you can see deeper into the lake. You can see things you couldn't see before. And the longer you let it clear, the more you can perceive. And so when you do this evocation, when you reach out and you do the ritual right and you do the protocols, honestly, a little bit of it is like only polite to reach out as well. Like you're reaching, I'm telling you, Spirit, reach out. Like I want you to come here, reach out, and now I'm going to sit and shut up and try to perceive you. And that's where the meditation comes in, and where energy work can come in as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's been very beneficial for me. Now, I will say a daily meditation practice is hard to just with life. It gets me because I try really hard. And the other day I felt so accomplished that I did a 15-minute breathing exercise twice. I was like, oh man, I did it twice in one day. Wow.
That is an accomplishment.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
I didn't even know you had that accomplishment.
Yeah,
It doesn't sound like a lot.
I didn't count it as an accomplishment, but I probably should have.
It is infinitely more time than not being able to do it at all.
Yeah. No, it absolutely is an accomplishment. And here, having been, doing meditation since my teens in one form or another, there have also been periods where I've fallen off my practice. And you know what's terrible? Like you go for a few months without doing your regular practice or without finding the time for meditation or something like that. And no matter what your practice was like before, you get back on the wagon, it's like, okay, yeah, no, it's hard finding the time. It's hard sitting still for this long. It's in so many ways, it's like starting at ground zero. And so, yeah, that it's if you're not used to meditating, 2 15-minute sessions is phenomenal. And you get the value in it, and then you'll make the time for it eventually. That's really how the time problem gets solved. Because the big problem is when you start, you're not, you're just, I mean, at least me, I sit and I'm like, I'm not doing anything. I'm not using my time productively. I'm just sitting. And then you got to sit, let it happen. You find the benefit. And then it's like, okay, this is beneficial. I need to make time for it.
Yeah, absolutely. And on that subject, I just sent you a photo on Facebook for you to look at because it relates to this topic. So I am also a devotee of Hecate. I've been in her service since April. And it's been a very incredible experience. But you were meditating, I believe, when she came to you in the first place. Could you go into that? Because I want to get into her in the book, and Saint Cyprian and Lucifer, and these three figures that are so central to a lot of what you do. But what your experience has been like from the beginning with Hecate, and how she's kind of transmitted this information to you that you've put into so many of these books.
Yeah. So, it's funny. Nowadays, people all the time are sort of like, the spirit came to me out of the blue and, wants me to do, et cetera, et cetera. And I always say, yeah, this has happened to me twice, like that a spirit has come from out of the blue without me prompting or anything like that. And the one time was Hecate. And I was, what I will say is when I asked about it and sort of like, why did you come? And at that time, like, is there something special about me? And the answer was no, not really. You like blow your ego up, but no, not really. Like you were the right person for this job and you were special in that you were qualified, but no, like that's it. And what that means is I'm interested in magic, and that has been a reality for me. And then in the 90s, I got involved in Tibetan Buddhism through my interest in magic. And at the very end of the 90s, I found myself living in Nepal in 1999. And I was actually on a Bunpo retreat when it became on New Year's Day 2000. But I was in Pashupatinath where they where they do open air cremations on the river, just like they do in Varanasi. And I was meditating on impermanence. So I was just sitting for 3 days, just sitting and imagining that I was the person on the cremation pyre and trying to meditate on what it would be like to have my elements dissolve like that. And things happen in meditation, right? What in Tibetan they call nyam. Weird stuff that happens in meditation is a great translation of nyam. And this woman with 2 torches appeared. Like everyone, I was still in Pashupatinath, but it was suddenly like everything got frozen. It was almost like time froze, but also all the people were gone. And she came walking up the ghat, which is like stairs that go down into the water. And she had 2 torches and said to me, "You're going home soon. And when you go home, offer me a supper. I have something to teach." And I was like, yeah, okay, cool. But I'm doing a Buddhist thing and I don't even know who you are really. So I just, you're in Nyam and I'm just going to go back to my meditation. So away, and so went away, but it stuck with me. Whereas Nyams don't normally, right? Like they come and they go, you see weird shit and it's over. But it stuck with me. It haunted me. And by the time I was headed home, I realized that she didn't just mean going home as in back to the States. She meant that I was going home in that I would be ready to once again open my practice to a wider world than just Tibetan Buddhism. I had been focused at that point for a few years on just Tibetan Buddhist practice. And I had learned so much and valued everything so much, yet it can also be very stifling. There's not a lot of, no room for creativity. It can feel, it like magic and a wider world held something for me that Tibetan Buddhism did not. And so I went and, of course, you look up goddess with 2 torches, like 2 torches, that's Hecate. So the friend that I moved in with as soon as I came back from Nepal, he was something of an expert. He has a degree in anthropology and an expert in Greek theurgy. Had been on digs in Greece and Corinth and so on. So he gave me Steve Ronan's book on Hecate and basically a Hecate primer. So I went down and cobbled together a supper out of what I knew from Ganachakra offerings in Tibetan Buddhism and Greek practice that I was just learning about. And there she appeared in this more, this form that I now teach with 6 arms and 6 legs. And she was attended by 4 spirits and said, "I have something to teach you." And she has been teaching and revealing things consistently in a cohesive system of magic for the last 22 years now.
Well, that's so cool.
That is an amazing story.
And I hope that, my contact with her has been I'll say this, it's felt very one way.
Okay.
And, I was, neck deep in very traditional grimoire work and studying it. And then I did the headless rite at one of my local parks. And that night I had a dream where my teacher was teaching me about the PGM and I was in a boarding house and the woman who owned the boarding house was a devotee of Hecate. I told my teacher about it and he was like, well, just try making an altar and seeing what happened. I go out and buy a bunch of supplies for it. That day, like a week later, a UFO podcast that I follow has a roundtable episode on Hecate. The night that I was planning on doing the ritual, I start reading Phil Hines' book on like Cthulhu and using magic to contact Cthulhu, and he's talking about being in a Wiccan ritual dedicated to Hecate. I'm like, okay, I get it. I will set up my altar now, and we'll see what happens. But no, that idea of her being so integral to your magic now is really cool and really inspiring, honestly.
It's a good time. I actually have a listener question for you, if you'll take it, and it's pretty relevant. It's about Hecate, and this is from, our friend T. Sterling, and she wanted to ask you, what is the one piece of advice you could give to anyone interested in working with Hecate? And I suppose she means, I don't know if she means a newer person getting into her work, but I guess a general, we'll say that generally. What advice could you give for somebody trying to improve their work or begin their work with that goddess?
Well, the first thing that I would do is to go to history in the classical period, right? And so even though my relationship with Hecate started with this wild revelation, I don't care for the term UPG, but it fits. Although by now it is neither simply personal nor unverified, but we can say this happened, and it's one of those wacky things, right? But even then, the first thing is like, okay, let's hit the research. Like, we had a revelation, let's hit the research. So if you feel called to work with Hecate, even if it didn't start with a revelation, go to research, because it can happen the other way around. Like, if you're trying to construct something, head to the research. Best book to start with right now is probably Liminal Rights by Sarita D'Este and David Rankine. Just super pithy, covers the period from, the theogony to the PGM, and touches then later on into Michael Stellis, mentions of her, and even into how she finds her way into Hamlet. But that would be the most accessible book. There's some others, and unfortunately some of them are out of print, but there's also a wealth of information online. But start with the image and the things that are historical before you delve into one of the many teachers that are teaching their own spin. And that includes myself, right? So if you come to my class, for instance, I'm sort of like, hey, if you want a basic knowledge of Hecate, check these out, because that's not what this class is about. So you should go and, check these things out, and I'll be happy to answer questions. But, and this way you have a basis from which to look and say, okay, well, this is a more modern take, but it's rooted in these things in a way that I like, or it departs from them in a way that I don't like, right? Either one of those things is valid. So that would be the number one piece of advice. Is there are a lot of people out there who are not even open to reading the lights, who are not open to even reading anything about it. They just want to kind of like check out a website and then pray, and whatever happens. But always try to find the thread between the past and the present, between what other people have seen and heard and said, and what you're seeing and hearing and doing. So yeah,
that's great advice. And it brings up a question that I want to ask you. I took Jack Rail's Hail Hecate course, and it was a great course. It comes at it from a very, very traditional historical angle, which I appreciate a lot.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm curious about, in your practice, either, in the early days or even now, how much do things like the PGM and the Chaldean oracles fit into how you work with Hecate?
They are more like sources that I look at to find resonance with, but not that I try to recreate. Like, I'm not at all interested in replicating a PGM experiment, and I'm definitely not interested in holding to the theology, for instance, of the Chaldean oracles. That's never been something that I've ever wanted to do or been terribly interested in. Yet, I don't want to be utterly disconnected from those either. So when I look at those things, I want to draw inspiration. I want to understand processes, but I don't want to replicate them. And that we're doing those didn't want to replicate, something older either. What the PGM is UP, the wild and nutty, crazy ass thing. What the PGM is like, that's like wild and nutty in its time. Like this is the crazy town stuff.
I would agree with you so wholeheartedly. I actually just made a post on social media which pretty much kind of was into that same idea, because it was certain people were like, well, UPG this, and I'm like, well, you're highlighting stuff that was essentially UPG of that time period. So it's all coming from the same place. It's all inspired, and if it's working, then
yeah, absolutely. I mean, I definitely love the PGM, and I think it's a great resource, but I'm also very into, meditating and just listening and seeing what comes to me from that, and maybe comparing it to the PGM and for reference, but also still valuing my own interpretation as being just as important.
Yeah, I mean, you can look at things and say, okay, look at the lengths. Like, somebody might read the PGM or any grimoire and think, okay, it prescribes this plant, which I need to get from, I guess it would be Georgia now, like from this area that was cultish once upon a time, right? So I need to special order or travel and get that or have it sent, because that is what it calls for. Meanwhile, for the person who was living in that time and place, so it's like we're bending over backwards to try and replicate something that was easy and on hand for the people doing it. The same thing with some of, their spells and rituals that call for ecclesiastic equipment. And it's sort of like, well, yes, because if you're a priest, that stuff's hanging around. So it's that kind of thing where we want to understand an old thing, but we want to understand.
No, thank you. And that's a good point that's on my mind a lot too. And it's, it's good to hear it that, a lot of the most important magic is the what you develop over time that comes from your own heart and your own work with spirits. And what you said about resonance really hit me too. Like, these things are all, well, most of them, they all can be functional, especially things that you feel pulled, that you understand, that are brought to you, that you can work with. And I think they can be even more functional than, you might have a spell that, is very powerful and written out, but if you don't have that resonance, it might have a more limited effect than something that you have to fill in the pieces yourself with and use your own experience and allies to help along. That's something when I get asked advice, it's similar. Now, it's interesting to hear thoughts on the PGM and especially Hecate. Octavian has been full blown being pulled in her direction. And he's come a long way. I don't think he knows exactly how far, but
well, I just know that I did the invocation in Consorting with Spirits for her to open the way of spirit, and then the next offering I did for her, dogs were just barking randomly, just in the background. I do it on my porch. I don't have dogs. I have 6 cats. I always wonder how she feels about that, if she cares or not.
Oh no, she doesn't care about the cats, but yeah, she'll definitely bring the dogs around for sure. Yeah. That's a sure sign.
For the last 10 minutes of the main show, I have a couple listener questions, and the first one is from a patron, Jude, and he is asking how important is it, in your opinion, Jason, that magicians should get in contact with their HGA?
It's how important is it? It's not important at all in that sense. It is, people treat it as a requisite for other magic. And this has to do with the approach taken by the Golden Dawn and Aleister Crowley and sort of what they made the HGA out to be. But it is not at all the point of magic. It is not an essential magic practice. It is not something that magic can't happen without. So it's, in that sense, it's not important at all. That's not to say that it's not worthwhile or that it's not an important operation. But if one is like, I want to be a magician, how important is it that I do this thing? It's not. You can be a magician and never care about it, whatever. So in that sense, yeah, it's not at all.
And I definitely agree. I feel like it's a good goal to have at some point, but you're doing yourself a disservice if you stop all of your operations until you get in contact. So yeah, I absolutely agree. And another question from a previous guest on the show, Quinn Cover, otherwise known as Man of Bandim. He has a couple questions. The first one is, does Jason utilize the classical protocols techniques of the grimoires, planetary hours and days, astral elections, Liber Spiritum, Spiritus Loci, swords, daggers, and etc.?
Sometimes. So it really depends. So I will use planetary hours and days if I am working with a system that demands them. So, in other words, I view the planetary hours and days as a lens that we've created for purposes that suit us, not as something that is intrinsically real with or without us, right? So it would be like, well, this is a rule of the house versus a natural law. Now, it's not entirely personal, right? So if you decide I'm going to do this ritual that relies on planetary days and hours, and you make a mistake, you're still going to get the effects of the hour that it actually is, not the hour you think it is. So it's not entirely just a personal issue or a lens of belief. It is something in between. It's like a current that you step into. And once you're in that current, you're subject to it. But if you're not in that current, you're not subject to it. So I will utilize planetary days and hours. I have a chat book called Advanced Planetary Magic, where I've got 49 different calls, one for each combination of hour and day. I've got, so at times I will utilize, I've done grimoire work as close to the book as I could. And I've done work with grimoire spirits that was a very far cry from the grimoires as well. Each one of them is an experience that is, builds me as a magician. You don't really understand the protocols of something until you do it. So when people look at the grimoires and they're just like, oh, well, we don't need that. That's a bunch of faith crap. That's a bunch of Christian crap. Let's get rid of it. Oh, this is going to take forever. I don't need to do that. I'll just do some Kundalini yoga breathing and be done with it. They're getting rid of things that they don't understand. But it is also true that when you do them and you understand them, if you get to a place where like, well, now I understand it, and therefore it is absolutely irreplaceable and must be followed to the letter, that's not adept either. Like, think about cooking. No cook is like, but you must do this, and there is no other way to make a grilled cheese other than this very precise way. Well, no, that's not true. And if you're adept at what you do, then you need to both have flexibility and stability. You need to have a harmony between those things, and you get that by following the rules and then bending them, right? So yeah, I do use the tools and everything else that you will find in the grimoires. There's no shortage of occult claptrap in this room. But at the same time, I would still be a magician if all of that was taken away.
Yes, absolutely. Quinn's second question is, do you, Jason, ever involve music or rhythms in your ritual? Sometimes,
yes. Sometimes spirits call for it. Right? They specifically, sometimes, for instance, if you've reached out to Hecate and you're getting signs and omens but no clearer communication, you can reach out and say, well, what would give clearer communication? And if you can't get anything directly, then look for omens that result from that, or even a divination that results from that, right? Like, draw a card and it's a person ringing bells or something, then organize, give it a whirl, like integrate some bell ringing in, integrate different colors in, so things like that. Yeah, absolutely. But it's not something that I think is necessary.
Yeah, that's very well said. His third question is, do dream experiences ever play a role in your work? Or do you just appreciate profound dreams, then move on?
Dream experiences absolutely play a role in the work. So there are two different approaches to dream magic. And it's good for a magician or a sorcerer to know them both and be adept at them both, but realize that one sort of negates the other, right? So if I'm trying to contact a spirit, or if I am in a mode where maybe I'm doing devotional work and I'm on the lookout for signs and omens and whatnot, then of course I want to let myself dream and take note of any dreams and symbolisms that seem important. Now, of course, the problem there is if you're spending, hours a day praying a novena to a particular saint, you might dream of that saint simply because it was the thing that dominated your day, and your acetylcholine neurons are like, these are your short-term memories. Let's make a story, and now they're in long-term memory. But so it might not have anything to do with the saint. It might just be that's what you did, so of course you dreamed about it. Like if you watch Jurassic Park, you dream of dinosaurs. But if something has teeth, if something sticks, then it's great. And then the other side of dream work is lucid dreaming, where you become awake in the dream, and now you're utilizing the dream state to do magic, to journey, to perform ritual, to meditate. But those two things don't really happen at the same time.
Yeah, I am still striving to get that lucid dreaming. It's been a battle. So one final question, and then we'll go on to Patreon. So Quinn asks, do you, Jason, separate mysticism from magic?
They integrate in practice, but the terms describe something quite different. So mysticism for me is direct experience that is yielded from practices that are effortless. Whereas esoteric practices might yield visions and so on, right? They're still like, I'm calling this spirit, I want it to come, I'm making this happen. I'm path working, I'm astral projecting, I'm going here, I'm giving the code word of Kabura, and I enter into this, whatever it is. You're kind of doing an esoteric ritual, whereas a mystic is releasing things. They're cutting through the cords that bind. So the mystic seeks either God or enlightenment by cutting through what normally holds us to our ordinary reality. It's a very different process. And it's the one that I prefer when it comes to spiritual growth, for lack of a better word. I'm much more comfortable, and I see much better results in people that practice mysticism rather than chasing the esoteric and for spiritual growth. Magic is the influencing of minds and probabilities. So for me, magic is utilizing spiritual techniques to influence probability in minds, right? Make stuff happen. And of course, it can involve messages from spirits, and it can involve spiritual growth and working on things. But mysticism and contemplation is a different thread. And they complement each other very well. If you're familiar with the tree of life, right? Like the Kabbalistic tree of life. So they always show like the flaming sword, right? Like you go up, then you over, then this way, then that way, then this way, then that way. And what I prefer is what I call the slip and slide. So it's mysticism. You go straight up. You realize that Malkuth is Cather is Malkuth. You find yourself in Malkuth by letting go of all the things that keep it from not being Malkuth, right? And then from that perspective of mystical attainment, then all the Sephir are below you. Now you can choose to go down the windy slide. So
I like that a lot. Thank you.
The chutes and ladders or the slippery slide approach to the tree of life. Like, use mysticism to go beyond the abyss, and use esotericism to make that the glory of that state manifest in your life on earth.
Very, very well said. And a perfect place to end the main show. So, Jason, thank you so much for coming on. Where can people find you, your books, your classes, and all your information?
Strategicsorcery.net. That has my blog and all my contact information, and whatever I'm doing, you'll find it up there. It's got all the links to the courses and things like that. So it's all there.
Well, that will all be in the show notes below. And again, Jason, thank you so much for coming on. It was a pleasure having you.
Absolutely wonderful.
And
to hear
as
those
always,
stories.
Patrons, there is a Patreon segment. For anyone who's not a patron, please go sign up, because this next conversation is going to be riveting. And that was our interview with Jason Miller. Man, he is fun to talk to. We really enjoyed having him on. And I can't wait to have him on again to talk about some new books he's writing and some new classes that he is teaching.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Just getting a chance to pick his brain and hear his takes on magic, especially from his personal experience. That was a real treat, like in a real sense. And just his depth of experience with Hecate specifically struck me as very valuable. And his sharing his personal story about how he began to work with her, and also giving some advice to others on how to work with that specific goddess. She is kind of a big thing right now.
Yeah, she is definitely experiencing renaissance, which is more than deserved, I believe. And as a devotee of Hecate, I very much enjoyed his input and his ideas about her and how to work with her. So that was a very enjoyable part for me. We did experience a little technical difficulty, so obviously there was a little jumbled aspect to the interview towards the end. We apologize for that. We will make sure that doesn't happen again. As always, there's a Patreon episode attached to this interview, so for patrons, enjoy, and for anyone who is not a patron and would like to hear it, you can sign up at our Patreon. It will be in the link below. It's only $4 a month to sign up, and you get extra episodes from this episode and many, many more. And as always, we will see you again on The Strange Dominions.